Chapter Introduction, Episode 6 Foundations of a Terrible Plan upon a Rich and Influential Young Man, who need not deny himself anything. It almost always happens in such cases that the extent of one's vices, and one stints oneself that much less the more one has the means to procure oneself everything. Had the Duke received a few elementary qualities from nature, they might possibly have counterbalanced the dangers which beset him in his position. But this curious mother, who sometimes seems to collaborate with chance in order that the latter may favor every vice she gives to those certain beings of whom she expects attentions very different from those virtue supposes, and this because she has just as much need of the one as of the other. Nature, I say, in destining Blangus for immense wealth, had meticulously endowed him with every impulse, every inspiration required for its abuse. Together with a tenebrous and very evil mind, she had accorded him a heart of flint and an utterly criminal soul, and these were accompanied by the disorders in tastes and irregularity of whim, whence were born the dreadful libertinage, to which the Duke was in no common measure addicted, born treacherous, harsh, imperious, barbaric, selfish as lavish in the pursuit of pleasure, as miserly when it were a question of useful spending, a liar, a gourmand, a drunk, a dastard, a sodomite, fond of incest, giving to murdering, to arson, to theft. No, not a single virtue compensated that host of vices. Why? What am I saying? Not only did he never so much as dream of a single virtue, he beheld them all with horror, and he was frequently heard to say that to be truly happy in this world, a man ought not merely fling himself into every vice, but should never permit himself one virtue, and that it was not simply a matter of always doing evil, but also, and above all, of never doing good. Oh, there are plenty of people, the Duke used to observe, who never misbehave, save when passion spurs them to ill. Later, the fire gone out of them, their now calm spirit peacefully returns to the path of virtue, and thus passing their life, going from strife to error, and from error to remorse, they end their days in such a way there is no telling just what roles they have enacted on earth. Such persons, he would continue, must surely be miserable, forever drifting, continually undecided. Their entire life is spent detesting in the morning what they did the evening before. Certain to repent of the pleasures they taste, they take their delight in quaking. In such sort they become at once virtuous in crime and criminal in virtue. However, our hero would add, my more solid character is a stranger to these contradictions. I do my choosing without hesitation, and as I am always sure to find pleasure in the choice I make, never does regret arise to dull its charm. Firm in my principles, because those I formed are sound, and were formed very early, I always act in accordance with them. They have made me understand the emptiness and nullity of virtue. I hate virtue, and never will I be seen resorting to it. They have persuaded me that through vice alone is man capable of experiencing this moral and physical vibration, which is the source of the most delicious voluptuousness. So I give myself over to vice. I was still very young when I learned to hold religion's fantasies in contempt, being perfectly convinced that the Chapter Introduction, Episode 7 Uniting in Secret Desires, Existence of a Creator is a revolting absurdity in which not even children continue to believe. I have no need to thwart my inclinations in order to flatter some god. These instincts were given me by nature, and it would be to irritate her were I to resist them. If she gave me bad ones, that is because they were necessary to her designs. I am in her hands but a machine which she runs as she likes, and not one of my crimes does not serve her. The more she urges me to commit them, the more of them she needs. I should be a fool to disobey her. Thus, nothing but the law stands in my way. But I defy the law. My gold and my prestige keep me well beyond reach of those vulgar instruments of repression, which should be employed only upon the common sort. If one were to raise the objection that, nevertheless, all men possess ideas of the just and the unjust, which can only be the product of nature, since these notions are found in every people and even amongst the uncivilized, the duck would reply affirmatively, saying that yes, those ideas have never been anything, if not relative, that the stronger has always considered exceedingly just what the weaker regarded as flagrantly unjust, and that it takes no more than the mere reversal of their positions for each to be able to change his way of thinking too. Whence the duck would conclude that nothing is really just but what makes for pleasure, and what is unjust is the cause of pain. That in taking 100 louis from a man's pocket, he was doing something very just for himself, although the victim of the robbery might have to regard the action with another eye. That all these notions therefore being very arbitrary, a fool he who would allow himself to become their thrall. It was by means of arguments in this kind the duck used to justify his transgressions. And as he was a man of greatest possible wit, his arguments had a decisive ring. And so, modeling his conduct upon his philosophy, the duck had, from his most tender youth, abandoned himself unrestrainedly to the most shameful extravagances, and to the most extraordinary ones. His father, having died young, and as I indicated, left him in control of a huge fortune, had however stipulated in his will that the young man's mother should, while she lived, be allowed to enjoy a large share of this legacy. Such a condition was not in displeasing Blangus, poison appearing to be the only way to avoid having to subscribe to this article. The knave straightway decided to make use of it. But this was the period when he was only making his first steps in a vicious career. Not daring to act himself, he brought one of his sisters, with whom he was carrying on a criminal intrigue, to take charge of the execution, assuring her that if she were to succeed, he would see to it that she would be the beneficiary of that part of the fortune whereof death would deprive their mother. However, the young lady was horrified by this proposal, and the duck, observing that this ill-confided secret was perhaps going to betray him, decided on the spot to extend his plans to include the sister he had hoped to have for an accomplice. He conducted both women to one of his properties, whence the two unfortunate ones never returned. Nothing quite encourages as does one's first unpunished crime. This hurdle once cleared, an open field seemed to beckon to the duck. Immediately, any person whomsoever showed opposition to his desires, poison was employed forthwith. From necessary murders, he soon passed to those of pure pleasure. He was... Chapter, Introduction, Episode 8, The Force of Wealth and Silence. Captivated by that regrettable folly, which causes us to find delight in the sufferings of others, he noticed that a violent commotion inflicted upon any kind of an adversary is answered by a vibrant thrill in our own nervous system. The effect of this vibration, arousing the animal spirits which flow within these nerves, concavities, obliges them to exert pressure on the erector nerves and to produce in accordance with this perturbation what is termed a lubricious sensation. Consequently, he set about committing thefts and murders in the name of debauchery and libertinage, just as someone else would be content, in order to inflame these same passions, to chase a whore or two. At the age of 23, he and 3 of his companions in vice whom he had indoctrinated with his philosophy, made up a party whose aim was to go out and stop a public coach on the highway, to rape the men among the travelers, along with the women, to assassinate them afterward, to make off with their victims' money. The conspirators certainly had no need of this, and to be back that same night, all three of them, at the opera ball in order to have a sound alibi. This crime took place. Ah, yes, two charming maids were violated and massacred in their mother's arms. To this was joined an endless list of other horrors, and no one dared suspect the Duke. Weary of the delightful wife his father had bestowed upon him before dying, the young Blangus wasted no time uniting her shade to his mother's, to his sister's, and to those of all his other victims. Why all this? To be able to marry a girl, wealthy to be sure, but publicly dishonored, and whom he knew full well was her brother's mistress. The person in question was the mother of Aline, one of the figures in our novel we mentioned above. This second wife, soon sacrificed like the first, gave way to a third, who followed hard on the heels of the second. It was rumored abroad that the Duke's huge construction was responsible for the undoing of all his wives. And as this gigantic tale corresponded in every point to its gigantic inspiration, the Duke let the opinion take root and veil the truth. That dreadful colossus did indeed make one think of Hercules, or a centaur. Blangus stood 5 foot 11 inches tall, had limbs of great strength and energy, powerful sinews, elastic nerves, in addition to that a proud and masculine visage, great dark eyes, handsome black eyelashes, an aquiline nose, fine teeth, a quality of health and exuberance, broad shoulders, a heavy chest, but a well-proportioned figure withal, splendid hips, superb buttocks, the handsomest leg in the world, an iron temperament, the strength of a horse, the member of a veritable mule, wondrously hirsute, blessed with the ability to eject its sperm any number of times within a given day and at will. Even at the age of 50, which was his age at the time, a virtually constant erection in this member, whose dimensions were an exact 8 inches for circumference and 12 for length overall. And there you have the portrait of the Duc de Blangus, drawn as accurately as if you'd wielded the pencil yourself. But if this masterpiece of nature was violent in its desires, what was it like, great God, when crowned by drunken voluptuousness? 'Twas a man no longer, 'twas a raging tiger. Woe unto him who happened then to be serving its passions. Frightful cries, atrocious blasphemies sprang from the Duke's swollen breast. Flames seemed to dart from his eyes. He foamed at the mouth. He whinnied. Chapter Introduction. Episode 9. A web of influential figures. Like a stallion, you'd have taken him for the very god of lust. Whatever then was his manner of having his pleasure, his hands necessarily strayed, roamed continually, and he had been more than once seen to strangle woman to death at the instant of his perfidious discharge. His presence of mind once restored, his frenzy was immediately replaced by the most complete indifference to the infamies wherewith he had just indulged himself, and of this indifference, of this kind of apathy, further sparks of lechery would be born almost at once. In his youth, the Duc had been known to discharge as often as 18 times a day, and that without appearing one jot more fatigued after the final than after the initial ejaculation. 7 or 8 crises within the same interval still held no terrors for him, his half a century of years notwithstanding. For roughly 25 years he had accustomed himself to passive sodomy, and he withstood its assaults with the identical vigor characterized his manner of delivering them actively when, the very next moment, it pleased him to exchange roles. He had once wagered he could sustain 55 attacks in a day, and so he had, furnished, as we have pointed out, with prodigious strength. He needed only one hand to violate a girl, and he had proved it upon several occasions. One day he boasted he could squeeze the life out of a horse with his legs. He mounted the beast. It collapsed at the instant he had predicted. His prowess at the table outshone, if that is possible, what he demonstrated upon the dead. There's no imagining what had come to be the quantity of the food he consumed. He regularly ate 3 meals a day, and they were all 3 exceedingly prolonged and exceedingly copious. And it was as nothing to him to toss down his usual 10 bottles of Burgundy. He had drunk up to 30, and needed but to be challenged, and he would set out for the mark of 50. But his intoxication, taking on the tinge of his passions, and liqueurs or wines having heated his brain, he would wax furious, and they would be obliged to tie him down. And despite all that, would you believe it? A steadfast child might have hurled this giant into a panic. True indeed, it is that the spirit often poorly corresponds with the fleshy sheath enveloping it. As soon as Blangus discovered he could no longer use his treachery or his deceit to make away with his enemy, he would become timid and cowardly, and the mere thought of even the mildest combat, but fought on equal terms, would have sent him fleeing to the ends of the earth. He had nevertheless, in keeping with custom, been in 1 or 2 campaigns, but had acquitted himself so disgracefully, he had retired from the service at once. Justifying his turpitude with equal amounts of cleverness and effrontery, he loudly proclaimed that his poltroonery, being nothing other than the desire to preserve himself, it were perfectly impossible for anyone in his right senses to condemn it for a fault. Keep in mind the identical moral traits. Next, adapt them to an entity from the physical point of view infinitely inferior to the one we just described. There you have the portrait of the Bishop of XXX, the Duc de Blangus's brother, the same black soul, the same penchant for crime, the same. Chapter Introduction, Episode 10, The Scheme Takes Shape. Contempt for religion, the same atheism, the same deception and cunning, a yet more supple and adroit mind, however, and more art in guiding his victims to their doom. But a slender figure, not heavy. No, a little thin body, wavering health, very delicate nerves, a greater fastidiousness in the pursuit of pleasure, mediocre prowess, a most ordinary member, even small, but deft, profoundly skilled in management, each time yielding so little that his incessantly inflamed imagination would render him capable of tasting delight quite as frequently as his brother. His sensations were of a remarkable acuteness. He would experience an irritation so prodigious he would often fall into a deep swoon upon discharging, and he almost always temporarily lost consciousness when doing so. He was 45, had delicate features, rather attractive eyes, but a foul mouth and ugly teeth, a hairless, pallid body, a small but well-shaped ass, and a prick 5 inches around and 6 in length. An idolater of active and passive sodomy, but eminently of the latter, he spent his life having himself buggered, and this pleasure, which never requires much expense of energy, was best suited to the modesty of his means. We will speak of his other tastes in good time. With what regards those of the table, he carried them nearly as far as the Duke, but went about the matter with somewhat more sensuality. Monseigneur, no less a criminal than his elder brother, possessed characteristics which had doubtless permitted him to match the celebrated feats of the hero we painted a moment ago. We will content ourselves with citing one of them. 'Twill be enough to make the reader see of what such a man may be capable, and what he was prepared and disposed to do, having done the following. One of his friends, a man powerful and rich, had formerly had an intrigue with a young noblewoman who had borne him 2 children, a girl and a boy. He had, however, never been able to wed her, and the maiden had become another's wife. The unlucky girl's lover died while still young, but the owner, howbeit, of a tremendous fortune, having no kin to provide for, it occurred to him to bequeath all he had to the 2 ill-fated children his affair had produced. On his deathbed, He made the bishop privy to his intentions and entrusted him with these two immense endowments. He divided the sum, put them in two purses, and gave them to the bishop, confiding the two orphans' education to this man of God, and enlisting him to pass on to each what was to be his when they attained their majority. At the same time, he enjoined the prelate to invest his ward's funds, so that in the meantime they would double in size. He also affirmed that it was his design to leave his offspring's mother in eternal ignorance of what he was doing for them, and he absolutely insisted that none of this should ever be mentioned to her. These arrangements concluded, the dying man closed his eyes, and Monseigneur found himself master of about 1 million in banknotes, and of 2 children. The scoundrel was not long deliberating his